Welcome to part 2 of our series that we've called Loaded, where we're talking about money and how God views his money in our hands. Last week we spoke about our relationship with money. I used the picture of the spitting cobra, the caged lion, or the ostrich, and then finally the eagle. And we spoke about the idea that God owns everything and he loans it to us and we steward it for him. I'd like to, for today and the next 3 parts that we have, to talk around what I'm calling the 4 engines. Now, I've had the privilege on occasion of traveling on aeroplanes that have got 4 big engines, 2 on each side. It brings me quite a lot of comfort when I'm flying over an ocean to look out to the left or to the right and see, man, there are 4 big engines keeping this plane going. If one engine was to go down, we'd still be able to make it. On the other 3, even if 2 went down, we'd still be able to make it. But I feel a lot safer when all 4 Boeing engines are going full tilt. And if I look at the Bible, take all the different verses related to possessions of money and how we should handle it in God's ways or according to his principles, for me they percolate down into 4 what I'm calling engines, 4 giant blocks that I should be looking at my finances and working on each 4 of these engines to get them as strong as they can. And the 4 engines are as follows. Number 1, first engine, is the engine of tithing. The second engine is the engine of giving. The third engine is the engine of saving. And the 4th one, spending wisely. So tithing, giving, saving, spending wisely. Tithing, giving, saving, spending wisely. It's of course possible that after we've been through these few weeks, you look at these engines and you say, well, I've got 1, maybe 2 engines that are going well. The plane can still fly forward, but I'd like to suggest to you, and this has been a challenge to me, that God wants to do more than just make it through our, with our lives and our financial situation. He wants it to be flying on 4 strong engines moving forward. So we're going to each week pick one of these engines, look at it, and hopefully it stirs some conversation. And you're really going before God and saying, I want to grow and strengthen each of these engines. We're going to be starting with engine number 3 today, and that's the engine of save or savings. In the Bible it says this, Proverbs 13:11, dishonest money dwindles away, but whoever gathers money little by little makes it grow. Dishonest money dwindles away, but whoever gathers money little by little makes it grow. In fact, there are verses about all 4 of these engines, and what's interesting is that the verses about these engines all result in some kind of blessing to us. If you read the verses on tithing, it ends up with me being blessed and kind of, in a spiritual sense, strong, developed. If you read the verses on giving, there's blessing that accrues to me. This verse on saving says the money grows little by little. Spending wisely, it also says that my life will be blessed. So none of this is for my bad. There's a really interesting story regarding saving that is found in the book of Genesis. And what happens, for those who've never read it, is that a Hebrew boy named Joseph is betrayed by his brothers and sold as a slave to a bunch of slave traders, and he ends up through a long series of events in Egypt. He worked for one of the top officials there, got falsely accused of rape, got chucked in jail, and he's now languishing in jail. And the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, has this dream one night. And it's quite an interesting dream because he dreams that there were these 7 fat cows that came up out of the Nile River, and then they got eaten up by these 7 super skinny cows, but the skinny cows didn't get fat after this big meal. And then he saw the same kind of dream with the ears of wheat. The big ears of wheat got swallowed up by the small ears of wheat, and he was really troubled. So he asked, is there anyone who can interpret dreams? And one of his servants remembered. He said, there's this guy in jail, a guy named Joseph. So Joseph comes along, and the Pharaoh tells him the dream, and Joseph says this. He says, God has revealed to you that there are going to be 7 years of plenty in Egypt, like never been seen before. But after that plenty, there's going to be 7 years of want, or 7 years of famine. And they're going to be so bad that you won't even remember how plentiful it is. Then he says this to the king. He says, what you should do is go and find somebody who's wise and who's discerning. And during the good years, we should save up much as we can so that what we save in the good years will keep us going through the bad years. This is all found Genesis 41, and I've been retelling verse 35 and 36. So there's a really great Bible principle here, is that we should store up in good years for lean years. Or, to put it another way, in our working years where we are earning, and I know that some people watching this might be unemployed right now, but in the months that you are earning, you save up for the years ahead when you can't work anymore. I'm thinking particularly years of retirement or old age. So Joseph's principle is that you never spend everything that you've got. That's what the Bible's praising here. But by saving money, we make it grow, and we are planning and preparing for the future. We're not doing this out of fear, of course, but because it's a wise thing to do. It's a good engine to have. Now, the interesting thing about money that is saved is that money is essentially working for us. So while we're working, we're earning money, but money that is saved, earning interest or earning returns, is working for us day and night. And some of you will be familiar with this concept, but it's the idea of compound interest. So if I took 1,000 Rand and I saved it at an interest rate, I'm just using 10% as a round number here. At the end of that year, you've got now 1,100 Rand saved, if I'm just calculating it very simply. On the 1st of January the next year, now I've got 1,100 Rand that's all busy earning a percent return. And the year after that, it's more than 1,200 Rand. And that money, if you see a graph of compound interest, the graph goes like this, like this, like this, and then it suddenly kicks up, because it's not just the original 1,000, but the interest starts earning interest, or the returns themselves start earning returns. Albert Einstein said this. He said, compound interest is the 8th wonder of the world. He who understands it earns it, but he who doesn't pays it. He who understands it earns it by savings. He who doesn't understand it pays it by borrowing. Of course, if you're borrowing, you're paying compound interest in reverse. In fact, even Jesus praised this idea. Remember last week's story in Luke 19 of the servants who came back with the master's money but didn't bring the right, the third one didn't earn anything back. Jesus said to him, this is Luke 19:23, why didn't you put my money on deposit so that when I came back, I could have collected it with interest? Even Jesus praises the idea of saving money to be earning returns or to be earning interest. I'd like to show you a graph here that's just a very simple graph that talks about the power of starting saving early. We contrast here the blue line of Emily with the red line of Dave, and Emily and Dave save exactly the same amount every month. The difference, though, is that Emily, who's on the blue line, starts saving at age 25, and Dave, who's on the red line, only starts saving at the age of 35. And at first, the lines are pretty close, but if you look from the age of around 55, notice how the gap between Emily and Dave's line suddenly mushrooms out. That's really the power of compound interest, is that the more time our savings are allowed to accumulate, to grow, to return, and for compound interest to be earned, the more the trajectory kicks up. And this is a good thing. This is stewarding God's money wisely. Remember, we're talking about one of the engines. It's the engine of saving. Now, I know that for some people, you've dipped into your retirement savings, you've dipped into emergency funds, you've hit financial difficulty along the way. And this talk is not in any way to try and heap any form of judgment or discouragement or condemnation, anything like that. But it's to encourage every one of us that actually the Bible celebrates the idea of saving now in good times for future bad times, or whenever times are good, whenever money's coming into our lives, that we are saving some of it at very least for the future. I'd like to talk about 5 practical steps regarding savings. And hopefully some of this is common sense, but as somebody said, common sense is unfortunately not that common. And a number of conversations I've had with people around finances, often one of these steps has been something that they haven't applied in their lives. The first step is to have a plan. To at least have a plan. Somebody said if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And when I'm talking about a plan, I'm suggesting having a plan on what you earn and what you're going to spend each month. The fancy name for that is having a budget, but the word budget simply means you've got a plan. And in your plan, plan to save. Saving is paying yourself, in some ways, a salary, or paying yourself a stipend, and that money, as I said earlier, then works for you as you're going along. The Joseph story, I'd like to remind us again. Joseph went to the king of Pharaoh with a 14-year plan. If you go and read that story in Genesis, you see that people were desperate. They would have died if it wasn't for Joseph's clever plan 14 years before. Having a long-range plan doesn't mean I don't have faith. In fact, it takes faith to have a plan, and then we trust God to help us and meet us in that. The second principle of saving is this: spend less than you earn. Spend less than you earn. Again, some people might say, Steve, that is truly simple common sense. The statistics show that many people get into a debt trap and a debt spiral because they consistently spend just a little more than they earn, and they borrow money to make up that gap. A really bad example is most of the governments in the world do exactly the same thing. Most budgets of most countries in the world have income and have expenditure, and they fund the gap through ever increasing debt. It's so normal, everybody just thinks, well, that's how we should do it. When that happens at a personal level or at a national level, eventually that debt is going to catch up, and the wastage of money spent on debt repayment is so great when you could consider, just by trimming a little bit here and there, doing without some things, saying no now for future yeses, current discipline for future benefit, absolutely celebrated in the Bible. The third suggestion is to build an emergency fund, if you can. Now, that again takes a little bit of time to gather and to put that money together, but people that are clever with finances suggest trying to have at least the equivalent of 3 months worth of income saved away somewhere that is relatively easily accessible in terms of catastrophic event in your life. Major medical expense, major accident damage, etc. And if that doesn't happen, well, if you've invested that money or put it somewhere safe, that money will be growing little by little each month. Now, that might not be possible for some people right now, but if we have a plan, slowly start building into that plan, a whole lot better than just saying, God, I'm trusting and I'm hoping on a wing and a prayer. The fourth principle is this, is to try and save at least 10% of your income, every bit of income that comes into your world. To try and save at least 10% of your income. Now, as we go through these engines, you might come to the end of it and say, Steve, you've got no clue of where I'm at. That's 100% true. I don't have a clue of where you're at. But I can tell you that these are some principles that if we start working towards them, God's grace flows and He helps us. I was raised in a family where we had a roof over our heads and we had a car to drive. So I guess in the context of South Africa, that put us in the wealthier percentage of people. But my dad didn't have a well-paying job. My mom decided not to work so that she could raise her 5 children. I was the oldest of those 5. And I remember a number of years in my childhood where we just went without food at the end of the month. And we'd desperately pray to God and say, please provide for us, and He often did. Times were tight in this sense that I don't remember ever getting new clothes as a child, or maybe once or twice. My mom sewed clothes for us, which I'm grateful for, but we often had hand-me-downs from other people. I'm not even complaining about that. I just want to give you some context that not everything was just easily flowing for us as a family financially when I was a kid. But the one thing that my dad did, it was an absolute for him, or one of the things, was that his retirement funding went off his salary before the salary landed, and he didn't touch it. He moved jobs a few times, he just moved that forward. So although we were battling here and there for various things, he never touched that retirement funding, 10% of his income going into savings. Very sadly, he passed away at the age of 67. We actually had no idea of what he had saved. He was due to retire that year. He had started a small business, and he was selling it on to a friend of his. He was due to retire. When we came to wrapping up his estate, we realized that this principle that my dad had followed through thick and thin had resulted in that money just little by little growing and growing. And even though it was split between 5 children, that inheritance, when it came to us, enabled us to pay a good chunk of the house that we currently live in. We built it from scratch. We were able to buy the land. And I'm so grateful to my dad for just month after month making a wise decision about savings. You see, the Bible says this in Proverbs 13:22, a good person leaves an inheritance for his children's children. A good person leaves an inheritance for his children's children. When times are tough, savings are the most difficult thing to do sometimes because it's for a long-term goal. But if I have a plan, from early, even if you're listening to this and you're in your early 20s, it's not too soon to start saving. I'm going to start saving for my retirement years and for my children's children by God's grace. That's actually a noble plan to have in light of the Bible. The fifth and final point I'd like to make today is that we should live by faith. It's very possible that when we talk about some of the mechanics of saving money, compound interest, etc., that a little bit of fear crawls into some people's hearts. Maybe you just somebody who likes to avoid all of that stuff. You don't actually like talking or thinking about it. You just want to live day by day, connecting with others and just going for it. And I'd like to encourage you, in light of this, is not to finish this video with this feeling of fear, but rather one of faith, saying, wow, I never knew that God spoke about that so clear in His Bible, the principle of saving. I'd like to pay attention to that. If we're not doing it already, we're going to set a plan in place. We're going to grow into it. We're going to go for it. We're trusting God for supernatural provision as we work on engine number 3, keeping the Boeing going forward. I've also done my very best in this talk not to give very direct financial advice on where to invest, etc. There are a load of clever people who are paid to do that, and you've got to follow pretty strict rules in giving advice, financial advisors, etc., etc. But a truly wise person would go and sit down with people who are skilled in that area and talk and talk and talk. I regularly have conversations, so regular, it's not daily, but over time have had repeated conversations with different people who think wisely about finances, just getting guidance, advice, their thoughts, and then building a plan that's built by faith, not out of fear, and just seeing God's unusual and kind provision in different times and in different ways to enable us to save. If you can save more than 10%, awesome. And if you're doing less, there's no condemnation. But let's work on keeping this engine of saving going strong. Engine 3, we look forward to seeing you in the next video to work on the next engine. God bless.